Okay, perfect. We're going to go ahead and get started with our peer support call today. I'm going to go ahead and turn on my video, and then as we have the presenters join us, they will be turning on their video as well. So thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Karen Romero. I am the Training Institute Director for Freedom Network USA, and we're really excited to be able to have this opportunity to have a conversation with the National Housing Law Project. They do a lot of work around housing, and especially for this topic, we thought they would be fantastic in really getting us the most up-to-date information on evictions and also eviction moratoriums and how they impact individuals that you're working with. So I'm going to go over some quick logistics. I'll introduce our panelists, and then we'll get started and turn it over to them. Next slide. So we have a number of tools that you'll have available at your disposal in order to interact and ask questions or add comments. One of them is the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. If you click on it, you can let us know where you're joining us from, but also if you hit all panelists and attendees, that'll allow everyone to see your questions, your comments, and that's what we would suggest. So that way, if other people may have similar questions to you, or they may have comments in response to your question, that may be useful. But of course, if you want to ask anything anonymously, just put it to all panelists, and I'll ask those questions for our panelists at the end. So towards the second part of today's call. We are supposed to have closed captioning, but our captioner is actually just joining. So there is going to be a link that's going to be included. And also, if you hit the closed captioning tool at the bottom, it'll turn green, and then you should be able to see the closed captioning there. And so that way hopefully you're getting the information that you need. We're going to go ahead and go to the next slide. So today's or I guess it's more really a conversation, is being brought to you by the Freedom Network Training Institute and the Housing Project. And so the Housing Project is a project to support service providers who are working with survivors of trafficking in order to learn about different resources, be able to look at different tools, discuss different housing subjects and topics in order to better serve the survivors that they're working with, and just expand their knowledge and get more support around housing. So right now we have been doing a series for different peer support calls around COVID. So basically areas of concern or challenges that are being experienced kind of throughout the US on different pieces and needs around housing. And so this is going to be, I believe, our fourth, it may be our third, but and it's really meant to bring you information from peers or for people that have been doing this work, so that way we can all learn together, be able to understand, the most current information, but also get ideas of how we can apply some of these principles or resources within our own communities. If you have any suggestions on what you think would be helpful for a peer support call to just hear from peers throughout the US, please let us know. You can put it in the chat box. You can put it in the chat box to all attendees and presenters, or you can just send it to us directly. We want these calls to be on topics that are useful to you, and so we would love to hear what's needed right now, so that way we can make sure that it's something that will be of value to you all. We also have bi-monthly webinars, and so those are going to cover different topics, or again, around housing for survivors of trafficking. The next one to put on your calendar as a hold is going to be on July 30th, which is going to be a Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And it's going to be discussing how to utilize VAWA dollars or VAWA funding in order to support housing for survivors of trafficking. And so you should see a registration email coming out in the next week or so. But please, definitely sign up for the newsletter, look at our website, and you'll see that information coming up for that webinar and additional calls. Next slide. Perfect. So I want to present our panelists today, which again, we want to really thank them for making the time to be with us. Today we have Noelle Porter. She is the Director of Government Affairs at the National Housing Law Project, and she's responsible for managing the relationships with Congress and the administration. And so she works really closely with the attorneys at the National Housing Law Project in order to monitor federal legislation and regulations. We also have Renee Williams. She is the senior staff attorney at the National Housing Law Project, and she focuses more on the fair housing and equal rights and access issues, including national origin discrimination, housing access for people with limited English proficiency, and housing rights for domestic violence survivors, including on the Violence Against Women Act. And finally, we get the pleasure of having Ariana Cook Captioning, and she is a Bank of America Fellow at the National Housing Law Project and focuses on housing with rights, especially around immigrants. And so we'll be able to hear, kind of some of the areas that are covered through those rights. So we're going to do a quick poll just to get a sense of who's joining us today. And we're just curious, for the survivors that you're working with, are they currently facing an eviction? So yes, select one option, yes, if they are, no, if you're unsure, or sorry, no, if they're not, and then unsure if you know that they're worried about it, but they maybe have not seen, anything more formal come down. I think what we've been hearing is that there are a lot of survivors and individuals who are worried, but they may not be facing an eviction, right at this moment. And so we're just curious what you all are seeing from your end. So if you'll just select an option, if the clients that you're working with, any of the clients that you're working with, if there are facing any evictions, we'll just give you a couple moments so that way we can kind of get a sense of what's kind of pressing. Is it that they're already facing an eviction? Is it that maybe they're just more concerned about what's going to happen, especially with so much uncertainty? So we'll just give it a minute and then we will show the results on the screen. Okay, so there's definitely a mix. So we're seeing almost like evenly split between, yes, some are facing an eviction, some of them are not, and some you're unsure, but likely may have heard of some of the concerns that they have. So thank you for participating in that. That's really helpful for us to just kind of have that pulse. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Renee, and she will get us started.
Thanks so much, Karen, and thank you. I just wanted to give a hearty welcome to everybody again, and thank you so much to Freedom Network for hosting us from the National Housing Law Project. We're really thrilled to be here and just really are looking forward to engaging with folks today and talking about this really important issue. And Karen, thank you so much for running the poll, because I think that really helps frame the discussion today and, get a sense of, what people are seeing. And it's actually not surprising that there's kind of an even split, between folks who are facing eviction, who, aren't necessarily right now, but maybe concerned about it and are unsure. And I think, just by a little bit of framing, the pandemic has really, turned our lives upside down in a lot of ways. And I think, because of the various layers of laws that apply when you're talking about an eviction, and, about to get into the details of that, because of the number of laws and types of housing that folks might be living in, it really creates this patchwork of, what protections may apply, what might be going on in a particular locality. And so there may be folks who are behind on their rent and think that they're in danger of being evicted, but they haven't heard anything from their landlord. And that's not surprising because of the eviction moratoriums that we're going to talk about today. But looking forward and looking on the horizon, moratoriums are, in various stages. The federal one that I'm going to talk about actually expires in a few weeks. And so, and I think that really gives us some urgency around thinking about and having a conversation about how we can keep people housed and what protections apply and what protections don't apply, because I think that's also just as important. So I'm just gonna take us through a quick roadmap of what we're gonna talk about today, the panelists from NHLP, and Karen gave a preview of this. So I'm gonna talk about, eviction moratoriums, what they are, protecting tenants from eviction, and what lies ahead. Noelle is gonna give us, a sense of what's happening on Capitol Hill in terms of Congress's response to COVID, particularly with respect to keeping people housed during this time. And then Ariana is going to close us out in terms of the discussion before the Q&A, is just going to talk about HUD's recent proposal that could harm immigrant families, that is currently being considered and reviewed by the agency. And so she'll talk about that toward the end. So a lot of ground to cover. But please, as Karen mentioned, please feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and we'll do our best to get to all of those questions. Folks who registered asked really great questions as well. Excuse me. And so we're going to try to cover a lot of those questions today. So when I'm talking about an eviction moratorium, so that's what I'm going to talk about. And just defining what that is so that we're all on the same page, regardless of your particular experience with evictions. But the general idea is that, and here's the big caveat, depending on where you live, right? So that's the first question, as well as what type of housing you live in, as in, is there a subsidy involved, who funds the housing, etc. The eviction moratorium basically says that you can't be forced to leave your rental housing during some period of time during this pandemic. That is what it means right now. And so there are two flavors I want to talk about today. And the first is going to be the federal moratorium, which was signed into law under the Federal CARES Act. And you've probably heard a lot about the CARES Act in various ways. With respect to serving our clients, but in the housing context for renters, and there are also protections for homeowners, but we're going to focus on the protections for renters here, just because of the topic. So the CARES Act was signed into law in March of this year, and so it has a few important provisions in there. So the most important is obviously that the moratorium prohibits landlords who are covered, meaning that they own a certain type of housing that gets some, specific type of federal subsidy, and I'll give examples toward as we move through this, from filing new eviction actions for non-payment of rent, as well as other fees or charges. So for those of us who, are advocating for survivor housing rights, and as Karen mentioned, in NHLP, we focus on DV, SA, housing rights in particular, particularly around VAWA. And so, we don't have as much expertise, in the human trafficking context, but I think, with respect to this, I think that this notion carries over. So it's really important to note, first of all, that the moratorium at the federal level, the federal moratorium, the CARES Act one, only applies in situations of non-payment of rent. And so what that means for survivors of, different types of crimes, including, domestic violence, for example, is that they can still be evicted for other reasons under the federal scheme. So for example, if there's a lease violation, Karen had asked me to, just talk about, for example, folks who may not be on the lease, if there's somebody who might be in the unit who is, not necessarily authorized to be in the unit. A landlord could turn around and evict somebody for that under the federal moratorium. So we have to be really careful to make sure that, we're not lulled into a false sense of security, or thinking, oh, there are no evictions happening right now because on the federal level, the non-payment issue is narrow. And so I wanted to flag that. Also, I mentioned, the eviction moratorium it's supposed to last for 120 days. So it went into effect in March. It ends July 24th, so not too far from now. But what it requires is that after that July 24th date, the owners that are covered by the CARES Act have to provide an additional 30-day notice requirement to evict a tenant for non-payment of rent. So that's important. And additionally, what the moratorium does is it says landlords who are covered by the CARES Act eviction moratorium can't charge fees, penalties, or other charges related to the non-payment of rent. So a lot of landlords like to charge late fees, maybe convenience fees, other types of fees. They can't be piling on these charges. And that's going to be really important for when we talk about what happens when the moratorium is over. So when I talk about covered housing programs, what am I talking about? So there are a few categories, and I really definitely I shared some different resources that we have that really break this down in more detail. But the idea is, one, these are federal housing programs that are covered by the Violence Against Women Act of 2013. And I will just say that gets confusing for folks because we're like, well, okay, does that impact VAWA? Does it impact the effectiveness of VAWA? Does it change the VAWA housing protections? And the answer is no. Basically, what Congress is trying to do is find a shorthand way to say, we want to include all federally assisted housing programs. And VAWA 2013 was just a convenient way to do it. So what we mean by that is Section 8 vouchers, public housing, low-income housing tax credits, USDA, rural development housing. So that's one bucket. Rural housing vouchers is another bucket, as well as properties with federally backed mortgages is another bucket. So all of this is to say, if you have a question about what type of housing your client lives in, there are a number of resources online. And if you go to NHLP's COVID webpage, which I believe is going to be shared, there we go. Thank you. If you go to that website, you should be able to find your way down into getting some of these lookup tools in terms of, if you have an address of a particular property, you can enter it in and see if your client's housing is covered by the moratorium. There are a number of websites. I will actually share those with Freedom Network, or maybe when Noelle's talking, I can, I think we're going to share the links so that you all have them for these various lookup tools. But that's step one in terms of doing that. So that's the federal moratorium. What are not covered by the current moratorium would be things like eviction cases that were filed before the moratorium went into place, housing that is not falling within one of these buckets, like, Section 8 or public housing or federally backed mortgages, or a rural housing voucher. So, like a strictly private unit, for example, would not be covered by the CARES Act. Sorry, I'm getting calendar notifications, so I'm gonna turn that off. So that's one bucket. And then, as I mentioned, non-repayment cases, right? So if there's a lease violation that's at play under the federal scheme, you can still be evicted, for non-payment issues. So basically issues that are not related to non-payment. So that's bucket one in terms of the moratoria. So that's the federal moratorium. There are also the second step. So I think the first step is really to figure out, does your client live in housing that is covered by the CARES Act? Second step is yes or no. Either way, you want to look at your state or locality to find out, does your state or local jurisdiction have their own eviction moratorium in place? And some of those moratoriums are broader and more protective in that they don't necessarily only cover non-payment issues. So you definitely want to hone in and figure out what your state and local jurisdiction covers. On our webpage, we have a link to, it's called the Eviction Lab, and they do a state by state breakdown of what types of protections are in place. And because those are all so different and so state specific, it's really hard to generalize. But what I would say is you definitely want to, if you're not an attorney, you definitely want to talk to a landlord tenant lawyer, somebody who does tenant defense in evictions for tenants. That's going to be a really important resource. And, if you don't know where to start, please reach out to me. I believe my email is somewhere, or not, I'll put it in the chat. And we work with legal aid advocates all over the country. We're happy to connect you with folks who can, kind of talk about your particular client situation. Couple of other just really important points, as we're thinking about the fact that the federal moratorium is expiring, as well as a lot of state moratoriums have begun to expire, as states are sort of in this weird situation where they're kind of reopening and kind of not, but that generally has meant that a lot of the courts have started to reopen. And, we've seen really horrible stories about folks who are, getting eviction hearings by Zoom, for example, that are not, there's just a lot of really problematic aspects of that, obviously. But so I would say a couple of takeaways as we're sort of in this transitional period right now before Noel we'll talk through kind of what's happening. One is the rent is still due, right? So, and I want to take a couple minutes and just talk about this piece. Just because there's a moratorium doesn't mean that, the rent has necessarily been canceled, right? The rent is still due. There's, as far as I know, there isn't, definitely on the federal level, there's nothing that is canceling back rent. So if tenants are able to afford to pay, they should do so to the extent that they can. Of course, a lot of folks are behind on rent now. And so a couple of practical pointers that I just want to underscore for folks. One, even during one of these moratoriums, because of how a lot of them operate and how they're exceptions, and particularly if you're dealing with survivors and you have an abuser or perpetrator in the household, folks may still be being evicted for these reasons, even though, as I'll mention just really quickly, that is also unlawful for a number of reasons, but it still happens practically. And so if you get an eviction notice, if your client gets an eviction notice, don't delay. Don't think that, oh, because there's a moratorium, or I heard there's a moratorium in place. You definitely want to connect them to a legal aid lawyer right away so that they're not waiving any rights, that they are able to assert any protections. So that's number one. Number two, if your client lives in federally assisted housing, so public housing, Section 8, they have a Section 8 voucher. They live in another type of Section 8 housing. There is, and we feel like housing providers should be doing this more in terms of being more proactive about it, but your client can recertify their income if they lost a job or lost income. Maybe somebody who was working in the household may have succumbed to COVID, for example. So if they've lost income due to the pandemic, if they live in one of these federally assisted housing programs, and again, this is something that if you're struggling with or trying to figure that out, definitely reach out to NHLP and we can talk through and help you kind of navigate all of the different subsidies at play. But if your client pays their rent based on their income, they should be able to recertify if they're one of these HUD programs, for example. So if you have a client with Section 8 voucher and they've lost income because of the pandemic, what they should do is reach out to the housing authority and say, I need to recertify my income. And the idea is, oops, time is up. Noelle, I'm gonna steal like 2 minutes of your time just to wrap up. So that's really, really important. And it's important for 2 reasons. One, you want the recertification as soon as possible so that their rent obligation going forward is reduced. And 2, you want to recertify. Some housing authorities, and HUD is trying to encourage this, they are making the certifications retroactive to when the income was lost. So again, reach out to your housing authority or reach out to a legal aid attorney who might understand better how the housing authority works at the local level. But that's also really important. Secondly, or thirdly, I think, sorry, just making sure I'm hitting all of my points. The other thing is repayment plans, and this is why I'm taking some of Noelle's time, because I think it's a really important point to note. So as Noelle will talk about, she'll talk about the state of play of things, but right now we're just operating on the assumption that these moratoriums are going to expire. And so if you are in federally subsidized housing, you should reach out, your client should reach out to their landlord and try to enter into a repayment plan. A lot of landlords are doing this. And I would also just say too, for folks who are in non-subsidized housing, should also be reaching out to their landlords to try and enter into a repayment plan. But I really, really want to encourage folks, if at all possible, for a client to, before they enter into a repayment agreement, to have an attorney review it first. And the reason is one, you want to make sure that the repayment terms are reasonable, right? You want to make sure that your client is not paying 70, 80% of their income in rent because they're also paying these rental arrearages. So I think that's number one. Number two, you want to make sure, the reason why it's really important to have an attorney review it, you want to make sure that the repayment agreement doesn't have other terms or waiving other rights. Some states may actually not allow tenants to waive certain rights that they might have. So you just want to have an attorney with knowledge of landlord-tenant law wherever you're located to look for any potential landmines in the repayment agreement. Because basically you want to make sure that your client is set up for success, so that they are able to stay in their housing and they're not just going to be evicted, a few months from now. And then finally, and I know there's a lot of information in here, but I just wanted to, and somebody in the chat, I kind of saw out of the corner of my eye, asked a really good question. And I just wanted to stress the fact that if it's a non-payment eviction, so if it's another reason related to rent, and I'm gonna go ahead and take this now just because it segues into the last point I want to make. So for example, if you're dealing with a survivor and say it's a survivor of domestic violence or sexual assault, and they live in one of these HUD programs, they should not be evicted if it's for reasons related to the abuse. That is a clear violation of VAWA. Another point is, housing providers that are covered by VAWA should not be holding survivors to a higher standard. So if it's nuisance activity, if it's criminal activity, et cetera, housing providers can't target survivors and using these vague sort of definitions of what it means to engage in, quote unquote criminal activity, et cetera, to evict a survivor. If your client does not live in federally subsidized housing, so doesn't enjoy the VAWA protections, there also may be both state and federal protections under fair housing laws. So just one really quick example, you know, if a landlord is trying to evict a survivor because of damage to the unit, something that's directly related to the abuse, depending on the circumstances, and everything is very fact specific, and I feel like that's just a refrain of being a lawyer. We always say that. You know, fair housing laws may apply and may offer protections, including defenses to eviction. So, you know, I feel like a broken record, but really the key takeaway, I would say, one is your client gets any sort of eviction notice or anything that looks like an eviction notice, you should talk to a lawyer right away to make sure that their rights are preserved. And two, as they're thinking about repayment plans, you know, really make sure that the repayment plan terms are fair and that somebody looks at it for any potential pitfalls. And then three, and then sorry, Noelle, I know I've like totally eaten into your time. The other just really important thing is if your client experiences a disability, also just think about how reasonable accommodations may be able to help either stop an eviction or at least, you know, buy your client more time. And so with all of that, I will turn it over to Noelle. And I know I covered a lot of different things, but I would say I'll put my email in the chat box. Folks, feel free to reach out for questions. And with that, send it over to Noelle, who's going to talk about the lay of the land in terms of the coronavirus response. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks so much, Renee. I want to underscore one thing that I think was early on in the presentation from Renee, and that's when you're looking to see if your client is covered, we'll be sending out all of these links that we've provided and that are in the chat function, but there's not a one-stop shop. So it's not like if you go to the eviction lab for the state policies, then you have your answer fully. Honestly, you're going to kind of have to click through everything because landlords are going to try not to acknowledge that they may be covered by LTAC or they may have a federally backed mortgage. And so it's really important to be very thorough in helping people to understand whether or not they're covered by the current moratorium. So it's tedious, it's heavy upfront work, but very important. So I want to switch now to talking about some of the I'm trying to get this smaller so I can read my slides. Perfect. Some of the non-monetary solutions that you can use as support for your clients to try to advocate on their behalf in the either because there is a moratorium, but obviously they're going to be facing arrears shortly, or if they're not covered by a moratorium, or if you're kind of in this sort of fuzzy space between whether or not everything's going to work out. And so we have a full kind of recommendation of policies that state and local governments should be adapting to get to a place where landlords are working with their clients. But in the interim, what we really suggest is if you are advocating on behalf of your client or you're trying to sit down and look at all the ways you can keep them from losing their housing, you should sit down maybe with either the tenant and explain these things to them, or sit down with the tenant and the landlord to try to mediate the conversation, or at best, work with a local legal aid attorney to try to have these conversations. But some of the options that may exist are that you can negotiate a repayment plan, and negotiate sounds intimidating, but really sit down and say, would you be willing to work out a long-term repayment plan for some of the rent that will be owed when the moratorium lifts, or because we're not covered by the moratorium, can we be enacting a repayment plan right now? As Renee mentioned too, if you have federally assisted or a subsidized housing of any kind, you want to be working with the PHA to recertify your income. And similarly, if you've got kind of a sympathetic landlord and you say, listen, we've lost this much income for our family, or I'm on furlough, or, I get fewer hours. Can we negotiate a repayment plan of current rent as we work through this crisis time? You can also work with the landlord to try to prohibit late fees or charges. So oftentimes, let's say the landlord charges $25 per day beyond rent owed, you might be able to say, can we please waive the fees, but I'll continue to work to gather the funds to repay you. So that'll keep me in the housing longer. You can encourage those landlords not to report the evictions, unpaid rent, or other debt to credit reporting agencies, so that we're not, obviously we still have arrears, we still have rent owed, maybe we do get an eviction for the client, but to keep that off of the record, you can assure that the client won't have as much trouble finding new housing when they have better resources. One thing that's really important, especially if you have like a caregiver situation or an elderly family member who needs assistance, et cetera, is typically you can't just add a family member to your lease without cause. But if you work with a landlord to say, like, we really would like to let grandma move in with us during this time, or we need to take, our nephews and nieces in with us during this time, which they wouldn't be on the rent, but me, your sister's coming with you. If you can work to get kind of an off schedule negotiation of adding a family member to the lease, or saying, this person's going to come in and take care of me because of illness or challenges during this time, and can make them the primary leaseholder so they're responsible for the rent. So if families are consolidating, using that opportunity to see if the landlord will be kind and do this at a time where it's not a lease renewal. Similarly, a lot of tenants may say, I'm facing eviction, I can't pay, and I'd rather not have an eviction on my record, though I'm going to leave and I'm going to go move in with my sister or move in with my aunt, and I'd like to be released from the rental agreement or the lease without penalty. And I would hope that we'd have, friendly landlords kind of willing to accommodate some of those needs in this time. So these are some of the ideas or ways, as you continue to see whether or not a client is covered, as you continue to try to seek legal aid or assistance for them, ways that you can be in discussions with the tenant and or the tenant and the landlord. Or let's say we're working with a trafficking victim whose primary language is not English, but they do have a family member who speaks more comfortable English, and you'd like to get them engaged in a conversation with the landlord to try to negotiate. All of those different ways that you might try to open up a dialogue with the landlord or the owner while we work through this very crazy time. These are some different ways that you can engage at that level and be an advocate for your client. I want to talk a little bit now about some of the funding that exists, and then we'll shift into the politics of what is on the horizon or new protections that may be added in the next bill. So Renee did a great job of talking about the moratorium that exists within the CARES Act, and what some of the limitations are and some of the ways that you have to be proactive to make sure that folks get those protections. The other thing is that within the CARES Act, there is a provision for a small amount of rental assistance. So the act included $4 billion for emergency solutions grants, which if any of your folks have moved through the homeless services system, you might be familiar. The COCs, or the continuum of care within homeless services, were awarded the first $1 billion straight out to spend those dollars exactly as they have been as long as ESG has existed. And that means building out more beds, providing shelter services, having additional staff in shelters to provide all the resources necessary. The second $2 billion was mostly awarded to the same grantees, but it has a broader allowable use. And so folks may be able at the local level to use those ESG dollars to provide emergency rental assistance to individuals who may be facing eviction. What we've seen anecdotally is that largely COCs are still spending this on homeless interventions and services, But oh goodness, somebody dropped off a package and the dog is going to take a minute to defend the house. Emerson, please stop. No. He's a very good guard dog. Hush. That's so embarrassing. We're all working from home. So thank you, Lisa. The funding in the second $2 billion has just been distributed. There's a resource here where you can look up, and we'll send it out, where you can look up who has the funding. And VAWA and stuff in your local community and work with those COCs to try to provide some relief. Goodness. Okay. I'm causing chaos. We're all going nuts here. So the funds, so you might be able to work with your local homeless services providers to be willing to distribute some of those funds as emergency rental assistance. So as Renee said, just because there's a moratorium doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to pay rent through these months. It's mail. So if you can get local entities to provide some rental assistance in the current moment, you can help folks pay through the moratorium and prevent those big arrearages that might be stacking up come next month. So the other thing is that a lot of state localities are establishing their own emergency rental assistance grants. For example, Maryland just established a $30 million pool of money to keep folks housed. And so it's really important to kind of be reading up in what's going on locally and understanding if there will be a pot of money available that you can tap that simply will pay 1 month's rent or pay that 1 month utility for your folks that are living in the darkness, or all these different things. So it's really helpful to start to know what the state and local resources are for funding. So I'm going to close my portion of this conversation with a discussion of kind of what's happening in Congress right now. So the HEROES Act is the next version of CARES, or the next relief package that we expect from Congress. What's interesting is that largely the housing provisions within the HEROES Act have been negotiated in the Senate. But the big top line items that you hear about in the news, like insurance protections or whether or not we're going to extend unemployment insurance bonuses, et cetera, are holding up the rest of the smaller provisions. So we're kind of small potatoes compared to some of the major stuff happening in the Senate. But there are some things that are still, on the fence. So the House passed the HEROES Act, and it contained a near universal moratorium that would extend to privately owned units and would also extend the moratorium for an additional 12 months. That prospect in the Senate is weak at best. We're kind of hoping we could get the universal. We don't think that 12 months is realistic. It could be negotiated down or it could be negotiated out. But we're largely pushing to expand and extend the moratorium. And that's got some broad support by leadership, but it's still up for debate when everything comes to the chopping block finally. The bill also contains $111 billion for ESG. So what's really interesting about what would happen in this package is that 11.5 would go to the homeless services we were discussing. But $100 billion of those funds would be directed only to emergency rental assistance based on the income qualifiers of the tenants and their necessities. And a lot of it would be distributed through new grantees, because we're talking about ESG is typically about a $2.4 billion annual appropriation. And so $100 billion is obviously going to be up for grabs in a lot of localities. And so one of the things we really are going to want to help folks understand is that some of your agencies might want to apply. Some of your organizations, especially if you're a nonprofit, might want to apply for these grants, this $100 billion in rental assistance, and distribute it to your trafficking victims, to your sexual assault and domestic violence survivors, to the folks you're working with on the ground. And nonprofits will not be limited to some of the restrictions on undocumented immigrants. And there's heavy legal analysis that Ariana has done, and she can talk about that, and it is very complicated, but mostly nonprofits don't have to ask the questions about undocumented status to be able to give assistance. And so it will be really important that new folks step up in this space, and we're doing a lot of work on this. You'll see more resources on this coming forward from us in the future. But those $100 billion would go through the ESG funding stream, which is a part of HUD. I just saw this question. But new grantees could apply. And so those dollars, ESG goes to the state, and then the state picks all of the grantees. So, you know, your organizations or your municipalities would want to plug into applying for those grants at the state level. There are a lot of resources on this. We could talk about this for days. And there will be even more as we near the HEROES Act passage. But really want to flag that as a future item that is going to be hugely important to our work. The bill would also contain $20 million for emergency vouchers that would be targeted to folks experiencing homelessness or folks that are fleeing domestic violence. However, those would be highly subject to the immigration restrictions, so it's really important to note the difference for that. I'm going to pass it to Ariana at this point. And again, as Karen has assured you, we'll have time for questions after. And I'll post my email in the chat function so that we can field questions from folks in the future. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Noelle. So I'm going to give a very, very quick rundown of the proposed mixed status families rule coming from HUD. And I will be giving a very, very quick review of that, just because I know a lot of people have lots of questions on Noelle and Renee's presentations. But I just want to flag that everything that I talk about, there are much more in-depth resources on the Keep Families Together .org website if you want to learn more about this rule. So I'm going to go over what is the mixed status families rule and what is a mixed status family, what would the proposed rule change, and when can we expect this proposed rule to be finalized. So what is a mixed status family? Currently, eligibility for most of HUD housing is restricted by Section 214 of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1980. This law restricts eligibility for HUD programs to U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, and then a handful of categories of very specific immigration statuses. And this applies to HUD's major programs, including public housing, Section 8 housing choice vouchers, and project-based Section 8. As well as a couple of other smaller programs. So right now, people that don't have eligible status cannot receive assistance for these programs. However, they're allowed to still live in these housing programs and receive assistance if their families do, or if their families are eligible. So what a mixed status family is it has some family members that are eligible to receive assistance and some family members that are ineligible to receive assistance. And even if a family member that's ineligible is living in a mixed status household, they themselves are not receiving assistance because the assistance to that family is prorated, meaning that it's reduced by the number of ineligible family members. So that's the current rule. The proposed rule would change this by essentially banning mixed status families from HUD housing programs, because it would require that every individual in the household be eligible to receive assistance. This would be really horrible for a lot of mixed status families. At least 70% of mixed status families would lose their homes just automatically. And then the remaining 30% would have to decide whether or not they want to keep their housing or have a family member that's ineligible move out. So it's going to be the question of keeping their families together or remaining housed. Also would like to highlight that the rule also has some new documentation requirements that would impact everyone in HUD housing, since it would require that citizens show proof of their citizenship. Currently, you only have to have a declaration of citizenship. And then when would this rule be final? So this rule was initially published in May of 2019. There was a comment period which closed in July of 2019. And since then, HUD has been sifting through the comments that were submitted. NHLP helped out with a comment campaign that led to more than 30,000 comments being submitted to HUD, which was a lot for them to get through, so they're still working on that. There isn't a definitive date set for this rule to be finalized. There are rumors going around that the rule will be published in September. However, on the regulatory agenda, it says November 2020, so it's a little uncertain, but we are expecting it to probably be finalized this fall. And with that, I will stop talking about the mixed status families rules so you all can ask us questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I know we have just about 10 minutes, so I'll just get to the questions right away. One of the questions that came in was if you all could clarify if I think it was 111 billion, is that coming out through HUD? And I know the ESG funding and many of us in the victim services field, whether it's domestic violence or human trafficking, we may not be as familiar with these funds, and so oftentimes these are going through like mainstream housing and homelessness organizations. So we will, share, like, please connect with your continuum of care. Please connect with those programs that are getting ESG funding, because it's really important to have that relationship regardless. But also, there's a lot of resources that could be opened up to your survivors that you're working with. So I'll make that plug, and then I'll let you all answer where that money will be coming through.
Sure. So what's interesting about the 100 billion, which is separate, is that one of the reasons that ESG is not always used for rental assistance, even though it's an eligible use annually. A is that the funds are very limited, but B is that those dollars go to and some small nonprofits who reach for the funds because they know they can administer them. And they have a very tight definition of who's eligible for that rental assistance, though. It usually involves having a notice of eviction, et cetera. Oh, it's 100 billion. Thank you, Lisette. And so it's just a couple zeros. I don't know why we're having to distinguish this. So the definition for using ESG for rental assistance typically is somewhat narrow, and a very small amount of folks, those grantees, know how to use it. And so what Karen said is absolutely correct. Connect with your COC on whether or not they'd be willing to spend some of those dollars in that way in terms of the $4 billion that they got from the CARES Act. That's hugely important. What's really interesting about the 100 billion that would be in HEROES is that it only requires an income level certification. They're supposed to start at the bottom with the most vulnerable folks with the lowest incomes and distribute those funds. And so it's going to be a free-for-all. COCs will have no way of using, what is essentially a 300-time increase in the number of dollars they typically get. And so we're going to be encouraging all types of local nonprofits who work with folks who may be facing evictions to apply for these funds at the state level. So typically, the state gets awarded its percentage of the ESG dollars for the year, and they open it up to grantees, but just because of experience, COCs go after it. Because this is going to be a huge influx, we really want people who are plugged into the resources we're providing about how to use it to go after those dollars. And so that's when you kind of have to start watching your application. Goodness, Dan Morrison is really angry about trafficking and eviction. Your application to the state is what's going to matter. So yes, it comes from HUD, but you'll be paying attention to how many dollars your state was allocated, and you'll need to apply to the state to be a new grantee. And so that information isn't available yet because the $100 billion isn't real yet. It could end up being 75 or 60 billion, depending on what the Senate will give us. But it's going to be hugely important then to kind of tune in if you want to participate, or if you want to get your partners to participate, or if you want the city to do things in a certain way. So hope that answers that question.
Perfect, thank you. Another question that had come in earlier was if the protections that you all were talking about apply to people whose lease has run out, or if they are in a program agreement but not necessarily a lease.
So I'll take this, but Renee, you can also step in for sure. I saw that question when I was talking about some of the non-monetary solutions, and there still might be ways where you can advocate for a better response from the landlord by saying, like, can we extend the program agreement, or can I'm over the lease, but can you extend the repayment plan that for the monies that I owe you? In reference to whether or not ESG dollars can be distributed to someone whose lease has ended, yes, you can use these payments retroactively to pay off arrears that are owed.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you, Noelle. And I would just say, I think it gets really tricky because if we're talking about the eviction moratorium and we are talking about non-payment of rent, then, I would say, the protection for non-payment of rent probably doesn't apply. I think I will just say this. It's going to depend a lot on your state law because that's what's going to govern landlord-tenant law. The CARES Act moratorium is really targeted at non-payment, and it'll be a question, I feel like, under state law, whether or not, say, your lease maybe has expired and now you're month to month, and that'll be a question of state law as to whether that still perpetuates a tenancy or not under state law. So I would say if you're dealing with these, and I would also just say, for VAWA, it really depends on the type of housing program that you're in. But there always can be arguments that are made as to, if you didn't recertify your income and you're part of a HUD program and that was for reasons related to the abuse, there may be some advocacy you can do there to try and get the assistance reinstated. But when we're talking specifically about the CARES Act moratorium, we are talking just about the non-payment of rent issue and not other issues that may be about, somebody who's there in the unit and maybe they're not authorized to be in the unit, et cetera. But all of this is to say, reach out to us for these individual questions because very likely we'll have to reach out to somebody in your state to figure out what a state landlord-tenant laws say about this, and they're just different layers. So I hope that was a satisfactory answer. I know it's really hard to generalize when we're talking about these state landlord-tenant laws, so I don't want to give you incorrect information. So, but reach out to me, whoever asked that question, if you want to talk in more detail.
Perfect. And I know we have just a couple minutes left, so I'll finish up with one question that had come in is what sort of guidance should people give survivors who may be in a more informal setting where they don't have a lease, they might not be the primary leaseholder. We know a lot of survivors often who are undocumented may be renting rooms. So, what kind of protections could exist there? Or, because we're low on time, where can they go? What can they do to get some guidance on it?
So yeah, just really quick, couple of really just quick things. One, if you have a client who's living in one of the VAWA covered programs, so it's a Section 8, et cetera, and they're not on the lease or they're not in the household, and the abuser is head of household, there is a way to bifurcate the lease such that a survivor can have an opportunity to prove that they themselves are eligible for the assistance because, for that reason. So that's lease bifurcation, and please reach out to me on that. And then for folks who are maybe renting a room, that's probably also going to be a topic of state and local law in terms of who is protected in terms of, in an eviction case. But I will say for the purposes of the moratorium, if it's a non-payment issue, right, then those protections should extend to whoever the head of household is. So there shouldn't be an eviction happening, but obviously if the landlord finds out that somebody is an unauthorized occupant, they could try and evict that person. So, you know, again, it's sort of a, it's really fact specific. So, yeah.
Perfect, thank you. And I know we're at time and there's so many questions, so we will include the presenters' information as far as their contact information on the chat. We'll also be following up next week with a recording of this webinar or this call, as well as all the resources that were listed or that were shared, and additional ones that we think might be useful. And again, it seems like there's a lot of questions and interest, and so there may be space for a follow-up call just on this. And so if you have any questions, if you all have any thoughts of topics that you all would find useful, especially navigating housing during this time, please let us know. We want to make these spaces available for you. And we just want to thank NHLP for joining us today. And we will be talking soon.